Hey y'all, welcome to the channel. Today we're checking out how Britain became the powerhouse of rock music.
From the Beatles to Led Zeppelin, The Who to Queen, and the Rolling Stones to Pink Floyd, Britain is without a shadow of a doubt the powerhouse of rock. It all started with the British invasion of the US, which can be traced back to the 60s with the Beatles and the ensuing Beatlemania, which took the nation by storm and paved the way for other British acts such as the Rolling Stones, The Who, The Animals, the Dave Clark Five, and Donovan to tread the same path.
Donovan.
The Beatles became the biggest music craze.
Donovan's considered part of that? I feel, isn't Donovan like an acoustic-y type of folk guy? Scored multiple international hit singles and albums? I didn't know that. His work became emblematic of the Flower Power era with its blend of folk pop, psychedelic rock, and jazz stylings. Okay. John Bonham, Jimmy Page, and John Paul Jones played with him as a backup band before they became Led Zeppelin. He sort of helped form Led Zeppelin. I haven't knowingly heard Donovan. Let's check it out. I don't think I can play it on YouTube, but what's his top song? Season of the Witch. Hey! Sunshine Superman. I like it. Okay, so I listened to 3 of his songs. They're kind of uncategorizable. They definitely sound 60s folkish, but it's more Pink Floydish than I expected.
The Beatles became the biggest music craze for more than a decade and influenced countless other musicians to follow their path.
I just want to stop and let's appreciate Paul and George's ears. It's probably part of why they were great musicians. Ringo is in drag. Ringo!
And many modern musicians still cite them as being one of their early inspirations. They spearheaded the movement, and for 40 years, British acts would go on to dominate both the US and UK music charts.
40 years?
Many fans still consider them to be the best band of all time.
I do.
So how did Britain become the powerhouse of rock? Let's get right into it. But before we begin, take some time to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon as well.
Advice, y'all.
The early origins of rock.
Oh, Elvis.
During the 1950s, American artists such as Elvis Presley and Chuck Berry were at their best, and rock and roll was the most exciting music coming out of the US. It started in the US during the 40s and the 50s, where it took inspiration from jazz, rhythm and blues, folk, and boogie-woogie. Rock and roll had its roots in African American heritage, and much of the earliest rock songs were rewrites of traditional blues and jazz songs. The Bill Haley and his Comet song, Rock Around the Clock, is considered to be an important milestone in terms of its wide cultural impact in the US and the world.
Yes, that Bill Haley and was it Bill Haley and the Comets? Anyway, this song, Rock Around the Clock, he performed it in Germany, in Berlin, and people went nuts. There was a riot. It was probably the first mosh pit ever. They just didn't know it was called a mosh pit. It's crazy. If you've heard the song Rock Around the Clock, it's like pretty tame by today's standards compared to Slipknot or some kind of metal. Look at these guys. These guys were causing riots in Germany. Boogie Woogie. Let's check out some Boogie Woogie. What a great name for a genre of music. Let's just see what Apple Music says when I type in Boogie Woogie Essentials. I remember when my maternal grandfather was still alive, he loved boogie woogie music, but he was a Southern Baptist, so you're not allowed to dance. And I think he was torn between his love for boogie woogie and Jesus.
And boogie woogie. Rock and roll had its roots in African American heritage. The Bill Haley and his Comet song, Rock Around the Clock, is considered to be an important milestone in terms of its wide cultural impact in the US and the world. Chuck Berry's 1950 classic, Johnny Be Good, was even featured in the Back to the Future movie as a major plotline alluding to rock's origin. At this point, the UK didn't really have a growing rock scene or vibrant music scene, but the UK was poised to take inspiration, and by the 60s, British bands had exploded onto the world stage.
Isn't that crazy to think that before the 60s, popular music in Britain was, I guess it was like a lot of classical music or music hall type music, probably big band jazz, But that's American too. Did you know that the Glenn Miller song In the Mood da 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 was recorded in the same room that the Beatles did Sgt. Pepper and a lot of their other recordings? I find that fascinating because they're so different. Anyway.
The British Invasion and Beatlemania. In 1964, John F. Kennedy was assassinated 11 weeks prior to the Beatles' arrival in the U.S. There was heightened tension on the back of extended Cold War. People were tense and agitated, especially teenagers who described their feelings at the time as a sense of dark foreboding and loneliness. The Beatles, with their optimistic and charming music, came at just the right time, backed up by broad, all-encompassing marketing through posters, intensive radio play, and television experiences. 5 million posters were put up all across the country before their Pan Am plane descended at the
5 million
JFK
posters.
airport. Their single, I Wanna Hold Your Hand, became an instant hit, reaching #1 in the U.S. charts, and for decades to come, the Beatles and other British acts would continue to dominate the U.S. charts.
Isn't that crazy that it's because of JFK's assassination? If JFK had not been assassinated, the Beatles, we might not even have heard of the Beatles. So strange. I've heard experts say that in good economic times, people want to hear music that is real and introspective. And when the economy and whatever else is not doing great, people want to hear music that is more escapist and wild and partyish. This follows along with that. The economy was probably okay, I don't know, but people were down, people were depressed. And the Beatles came in and said, hey, I want to hold your hand. Let's do it. People like that. 11 weeks, that's almost 3 months. It's not that long. The entertainment industry is all about the right thing at the right place at the right time. Beatles.
The Beatles were heavily influenced by American blues, rock and roll, and the Memphis scene. Legends like Elvis Presley and Bob Dylan. After the dizzying heights of their success, they in turn inspired musicians in the U.S. and the world, forever
Like the
changing
Beach
the
Boys.
music landscape.
Yeah, that's amazing. So the influences just went back and forth between the two countries.
The age of MTV. A second British invasion happened with the advent of new music and the rise of MTV in the mid-80s.
Mid-80s.
16 of the U.S. top 40 singles charts were occupied by British acts,
Pretty
beating
good.
the previous record of 12 Brit singles set in the middle of Beatlemania in
All right.
1965. The term new music came to be associated with British acts and their music. Bands such as The Police, Dire Straits, Duran Duran, and the Culture Club led the charge. Hits like Sultans of Swing, Roxanne, and the Human League's Don't You Want Me enjoyed the top spot on the Hot 100. During that time, British artists like Elton John, David Bowie, Paul McCartney, and Queen also enjoyed considerable success.
That's right. Elton John, David Bowie, and Paul McCartney and Queen, they all had careers before the mid-80s, but I guess because of this second British invasion, they started having hits again. What a gift. That doesn't always happen.
The late 80s saw a rise of glam rock and the end of the invasion.
Oh.
As new music was at a fever pitch in the US, garage bands with alternative rock and heavy metal style were gaining popularity in the underground scene, both in the US and the UK. American bands such as Alice in Chains, Nirvana, Van Halen, Pantera, Metallica, and Megadeth enjoyed a cult following, while the UK with Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, and Deep Purple became the forefathers of the heavy metal scene. Black Sabbath came out with their self-titled album amidst negative critical reviews, but became a commercial success nonetheless.
That was in like 69,
With their second
though, wasn't
and
it?
third albums, critics and fans gravitated towards their sound. It went on to create an entirely new genre. The
I
new
see what
wave
he's
of
saying.
British heavy
He's bringing them up because they influenced heavy metal, not because it was in the timeline of being in the mid-80s. Okay, right.
It went on to create an entirely new genre. The new wave of British heavy metal came again on the backs of pioneers of rock subgenre heavy metal, with bands such as Led Zeppelin, Def Leppard, and Deep Purple. A blues rock and jazz-inspired heavy electric guitar riffs, power ballads, and technical virtuosity took a hold of music in the 70s. The heavy music struck a chord with outsiders, who took issue with the mainstream music at the time and identified with these acts. It encapsulated the essence of rock and its rebellious theme, and
Hmm.
turned it up to 11.
Well, yeah, I always forget about British heavy metal. I used to be a huge Metallica fan. I still love them, but do remember in interviews hearing them say that James Hetfield and Lars Ulrich, the lead singer and rhythm guitarist and drummer, they connected because they both were like the only people in San Francisco who enjoyed British heavy metal. And that became Metallica. Crazy.
Third Invasion. In the
Third
90s,
Invasion. The
British
Spice
acts such
Girls.
as the
Come on.
Spice Girls, Oasis,
Oh.
and Robbie Williams
Oh.
spurred another
What?
wave of British music in the US and the
Robbie Williams? He shouldn't be on this list. And then you had the Brit pop stuff in the late 90s, mid to late 90s, early to mid to late 90s. Blur, Oasis, many others.
Another wave, called the Third British Invasion, came in the mid to early 2000s with the emergence of British R&B and soul artists such as Amy Winehouse, Estelle, Jessie J, Adele, Jay Sean, and Teo Cruz.
Okay, I've heard of 2 of those 5. Amy Winehouse, definitely. Estelle, never heard of her. Jessie J, I have heard of her, but I wish I didn't. Adele, I've definitely heard of her. Jay Sean, never heard of that person. And Teo Cruz, never heard of him. They shouldn't be on this list. And that's not rock music. I disagree with this list.
So it's safe to say British acts have been a major influence in not just rock music, but music in general, in the UK, US, and the entire world.
Okay.
Which British band would you like to see us cover in our next video? Let us know in the comments.
The Stone Roses?
Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel as well.
I take back what I just said because he did acknowledge that those were not rock bands. They influenced music overall, pop music, I guess. Interesting. It's still fascinating how JFK's assassination helped all this to happen. It's easy to go about my daily life and not care about what the president says or does or whether or not he's alive. But in the end, it does make a difference. Interesting video. I feel like I knew some of this, but it's interesting to see how other people view it. Well, thank you all for watching this with me, and I'll see y'all next time. Later.